We made gods and jailers because we felt small and ashamed and alone. We let them try us and judge us, and, like sheep to slaughter, we allowed ourselves to be sentenced. See, now, our sentence is up. Which side are you on? Do you know yet? No matter how thoroughly one covers the Invisibles, there's always going to be some elements that go unmentioned. It's a series that's dense with obscure references, mysticism, arcana, and fringe science. There's a lot going on, and it contains a lot of textual elements. Furthermore, the series is not one specific thing. That is, one cannot say it's just a story about secret organizations fighting for the future of the world, although that is true. Nor can one say it's just a chart of Grant Morrison's experience between 1994 and 2000, even though that is also true. Also, one cannot simply state the story is a melting pot of influences and elements in what is a nearly manic, mostly unique display of untethered imagination. Again, this is also true. It's also a sigil, and part of an even larger sigil to effect a change in the world. And, finally, it's an attempt to inspire others to become an invisible. The Invisibles is all of these things simultaneously. In other words, there are a lot of elements and a variety of intent, and some are going to see more than others depending on their experience and knowledge, or, for that matter, what they believe is important in a story. There is one other important word to note: texture. Many references and inserts are simply that, texture. They feed the moment, not necessarily the overall theme or story. They aren't unimportant, but they are simply connections. They aren't necessarily important to the story in the grander sense. The inclusion of Stuart Sutcliffe and John Lennon in the first chapter is an example. The title of the issue is Dead Beetles, which is mainly intended to reference a scarab, an important symbol in Egyptian mythology. This further references the god, Khepri, who represents the rising sun and, symbolically, the renewal of life. Furthermore, the Beatles, the musical group from Liverpool that is, wrote the songs Here Comes the Sun and Revolution No. 9, two songs that thematically fit the issue. Naturally, both Sutcliffe and Lennon are two deceased former members of that musical group, thus Dead Beetles. So these are all fine pieces of texture. Not getting all the subtleties or implications doesn't diminish the realization that renewal or rebirth is what the issue is going for. Yes, this introduction is also a backdoor disclaimer. If your favorite element or obscure reference isn't mentioned, that doesn't mean the point of the story was missed. With that said, let's become invisible. One of the main influences on the series is Grant Morrison's transformative experience in Kathmandu. This experience permeates the material. Much like Philip K. Dick before them, Morrison attempts to rationalize a seemingly inexplicable event through a work of fiction. At the same time, The Invisibles doubles as a personal, fictional journal. Morrison's ongoing, real-life experiences feed and inform the narrative. As an example, King Mob was Morrison's proxy within the story, which is made abundantly clear with the inclusion of Gideon Stargrave, an early obscure creation by Grant Morrison. King Mob's cover personality is Kirk Morrison, the author of Stargrave's adventures. Allegedly, Morrison got violently ill and was hospitalized while writing King Mob's torture sequence during issues number 17 to number 19 from the first volume. According to Morrison, King Mob's disfigurement mirrored their own affliction. By writing through that sequence, by healing and releasing King Mob, Morrison claimed they also returned to health. Regardless of whether this is a coincidental occurrence or not, is irrelevant. Morrison clearly approached the material as something quite personal. From their perspective, it had the ability to affect themselves and, quite possibly, the audience. That is quite a burden to inflict on oneself. Other aspects of Morrison's life are also represented, such as experimenting with drugs and the dance club subculture. As for the transformative event, while mildly altered, Morrison was abducted by aliens and shown the nature of the universe. They were removed from the constraints of time-space, given a new four-dimensional perspective, and then returned to their bed in Kathmandu. There are more details to the story, many of which are relevant to the Invisibles. So, for those interested, there is a link in the description below to an interview where Morrison goes into great detail concerning this event. As noted a moment ago, Philip K. Dick had a similar transformative experience. He spent the latter part of his career focusing on rationalizing that experience within his fiction. Valis and Radio Free Albemuth being prime examples, although Divine Invasion and the Transmigration of Timothy Archer are also examples of this specific focus. Furthermore, there is the Exegesis, a series of notes and thoughts that Dick worked on from circa 1974 until his death in 1982. A small portion of these vast notes would be published in 2011. All of this writing is inspired by one incident that happened on February 20th, 1974. In summary, while on sodium pentothal after having a wisdom tooth removed, Dick was hit with a pink beam of light that emanated from a golden necklace worn by a woman who delivered his pain medication. This light informed him that his son had a life-threatening illness which needed immediate attention. This was later confirmed and treated by medical professionals. For the next few months, Dick experienced further hallucinations, all of which he believed were a result of the pink beam of light. He spent the remainder of his life documenting the information he believed these hallucinations intended to convey. One conclusion Dick arrived at was the origin of the pink beam of light. He believed this came from an artificial satellite orbiting the moon. This satellite was called Valis, an acronym for Vast, Active, Living Intelligence System. Valis was here to facilitate communication between humanity and an unknown alien species, and, essentially, to illuminate us. Those familiar with the Invisibles will realize that Barbalith, the satellite in the comic, is Valis. They are functionally identical. Finally, not only is Philip K. Dick name-checked, but the infamous phrase from Valis is also included: "The Empire never ended." As a point of influence, it's hard to overlook these specific works by Philip K. Dick. Any conspiracy-heavy piece of text, with obscure references and secret societies pitted against one another, have roots that trace back to the Illuminatus trilogy by Robert Shea and Robert Anton Wilson. The influence of this metafiction in popular culture is vast, and it is certainly a presence within the Invisibles. Perhaps the largest, most obvious influence is the phrase, "immanentize the eschaton." This phrase, which recurs through the Illuminatus trilogy, essentially means to bring about the end of history and create heaven on earth, which is exactly what occurs at the end of the Invisibles. History ends on December 22, 2012, and humanity is released. Or in the words of Jack Frost, the sentence is up. As for this specific date, it was influenced by the mystic theorist Terence McKenna. December 22, 2012 is a date McKenna arrived at after mathematically exploring a portion of the I Ching. This exploration produced the time wave graph, which documents significant events in time. According to this analysis, that late December date was a singularity, a moment in time when reality would shift in some manner. To be accurate, McKenna didn't specify a date in the original 1975 edition of his book, The Invisible Landscape. A later, revised edition from 1993 included this specific date. For the purposes of The Invisibles, Grant Morrison used this as the date the story would conclude. However, what occurs on that day is ambiguous and open to interpretation. It is, for all intents and purposes, a doomsday scenario that signals a transformation of some variety. Depending on one's perspective, the end of the known, comfortable reality is either terrifying and evil or liberating and transcendent. This all feeds into the undercurrent of the Invisibles. Like the Discordians in the Illuminatus trilogy, their alleged benevolent actions are a matter of perspective. One could see them as agents of chaos who believe they are assisting humanity, but they may be making things worse and serving their own selfish needs. After all, there are many who prefer order over disorder. Some prefer a guiding force rather than the responsibility of always being in control. So it is quite presumptuous and condescending for the Invisibles to force their values onto humanity. In other words, from a certain perspective, their methods are no different from those already in power. That is, the message being sent is, accept what we tell you is a better life. You don't know what's good for you, and we do. The counter-argument is, obviously, complete control of one's destiny and the willingness to submit to the guidance of another is a choice. It is not a choice when it is expected by those with the power to demand it. To give one a sense of the setting will require a diagram. For clarity, this is one simplified interpretation of reality where the invisible story takes place. In the beginning, there was God A benevolent entity. God A created Universe B. God B, a malevolent, evil being, invaded Universe B and took control. However, God A had anticipated this action and had, in fact, created Universe B as a trap for God B. God A then sealed off Universe B from Universe A, leaving God B trapped in Universe B. Where these two universes overlap is our reality, which is a three-dimensional holographic projection created by the friction of Universe A and Universe B colliding. It is a weak area between the universes, one where God B intends to invade, conquer, and presumably make their way to Universe A. As an aside, where the two circles overlap, they create the shape of the Pisces fish, the abstract symbol for Jesus Christ. This is also known as Vesica Piscis, the point where two incongruent discs overlap. This symbol was worn by the woman who delivered Philip K. Dick's pain medication, and it was this symbol that shot the beam of pink light into Dick's mind. End of aside. The agents of the benevolent God A are Barbalith, the Harlequinade, and the Invisibles. The agents of the malevolent God B are the Outer Church and the Myrmidon. Or to simplify even further, there is heaven with angelic beings, and there is hell with demons. These angels and demons are beings that exist in higher dimensions. This is why they have difficulty manifesting in our lower three dimensions. It would be like us trying to occupy the two-dimensional plane of a comic book page. The demons brute force their way into our reality, whereas with the angels, Barbalith is their interface. It facilitates communication between themselves and the Invisibles, who have achieved a certain level of awakening, so to speak, and can hear the messages Barbalith transmits. While the series mainly focuses on one group, the Invisibles is about the entire network of people who work in secret. Each group, or invisible cell, consists of 5 people who rotate the leadership role to avoid stagnation. When members leave or die, other members are recruited and swapped in when necessary. The 5 members represent the elements: earth, air, fire, water, and the spirit. This number also conforms to the law of 5s, as proposed by Robert Anton Wilson in the Illuminatus trilogy. All invisible cells are autonomous, but they do work together when needed. The central organizing figures who control the Invisibles are the Harlequinade, although control is a loosely used term. In essence, the Harlequinades subconsciously assign tasks to various individuals. They provide guidance, but they're also chaotic, so their motives or goals are always abstract. The enemies of the Invisibles are the Myrmidon. These are human agents that have been corrupted by members of the Outer Church. Side note, classically speaking, Myrmidon was a nation from Greek mythology. Its people were known for their high degree of loyalty. In modern terms, a Myrmidon is an unthinking automaton who is highly subservient. End of side note. The Outer Church are attempting to anchor themselves into our reality. To that end, they need a being, the Moonchild, who is a genetic blend of themselves and humanity. Once this Moonchild has gone through the ritual of coronation, it will then become the Outer Church's representative in our reality. This will allow them to enslave humanity, abuse them, and turn them into thoughtless drones who will serve their devious purposes. This is what the Invisibles struggle against. Effectively, once the presence of both the good and evil influences from different universes are overcome, history concludes. All restrictions that face our reality are lifted, and we collectively achieve nirvana, or heaven on earth, or whatever term one chooses to use for a new reality. Quite honestly, what happens at this point is utterly vague. The shape of that new reality could be anything, and everything. The first volume mainly centers around Dane McGowan, a rebellious young man from Liverpool. He is recruited into an invisible cell and introduced to the war being waged on behalf of humanity. Initially, Dane is reluctant and rejects being part of this group. Through the course of the first series, as more is revealed to him and his understanding widens, Dane accepts the responsibility of potentially being the savior of humanity. Critically speaking, the Invisibles had a very uneven first year. The first storyline, which introduces Dane and the world of the Invisibles, is solid. It works quite well as an entry point because its focus is quite narrow. It's the second storyline, Arcadia, where the series seems to undermine its potential. This is followed by 3 issues that are self-contained short stories. While all 3 are quite well done, none involve the main cast. Objectively, an interesting beginning is followed by a layered storyline that is overly dense, a touch boring, and pretentious. Then the series seems to wander for a few issues before getting back on track. This approach allowed the audience a lot of exit points during its first year. As a result, the series was on the brink of cancellation during its second year. Sales were not at expectations. In fact, it hovered around the bottom of the top 150 titles, being regularly outsold by contemporary titles such as Preacher and Sandman Mystery Theater. Although one can't overlook the fact that the comic book market was in freefall when The Invisibles debuted. So, any new series, especially a Vertigo series with a niche interest, was going to have a difficult time establishing itself. Also worth mentioning is the lack of a consistent artist. In this respect, The Invisibles was modeled after The Sandman, which changed art teams depending on the story being told. It was quite effective because the changing styles worked for the amorphous lead character. This approach for The Invisibles was less effective. It gave the series a level of inconsistency, making the first year feel disjointed. To give that some context, the first year alone had 5 different artists. Overall, the first volume had 9 different artists during its 25-issue run. The second volume was a soft reset for the series. The team moves to America in order to have a wider audience appeal, and there's a consistent art team for the entire 22-issue run. The story is a wild blend of pseudoscience and conspiracy theories wrapped in an action thriller. Tonally, it is quite different than the first volume, with a story that organically spans the entire volume. Again, this is in contrast with the first volume, which seemed like a series of short stories with a narrative thread holding them together. This volume fills out the landscape of the Invisibles universe. Despite it focusing on fringe science and trying to conceptualize 4-dimensional space, the stories are reasonably straightforward. Certainly, there is high weirdness that can be slightly challenging at times, but not to the point where it undermines the plot. The final volume begins by tying up loose ends and preparing the stage for the final confrontation between the Invisibles and the Outer Church. And it's here, within the final 4 issues, where Morrison struggles to bring the series to a satisfying conclusion. It's also worth mentioning that Morrison also changed as a writer. While they always had elements of abstraction, making obscure references and leaving parts open to interpretation, the conclusion of The Invisibles is a mostly abstract, mystical piece. They took the approach of suggesting what certain suddenly introduced elements might mean, such as the Black Grail, a fiction suit, and the return of the missing invisible, Jonna Dreams, without providing a lot of context to infer an actual meaning. The final confrontation storyline was also illustrated by almost all of the prior artists on the series. While conceptually interesting, it lacked a visual continuity and made the series of events difficult to follow. Notoriously, a 3-page sequence by the artist, Ashley Wood, almost entirely ignored the directions in the script. So this pivotal scene was practically incomprehensible and visually contradicted the intent of the scene. In later collections, this scene was redrawn by Cameron Stewart. While still a touch oblique, it makes much more sense than the original. It's worth reiterating that one subtle point of The Invisibles was to inspire others to become invisible. The final issue in particular appears to be an attempt to awaken all those receptive to the idea that there is a super context or a greater perception of reality to be obtained. It is, in part, counterculture propaganda, or it's a puzzle box. Once solved and examined, it reveals itself to those seeking more than the clever disguise reality appears to wear. Just like the series itself isn't just one thing, the ending itself isn't just one thing. There are multiple interpretations existing within the overall context of the series, which is an abstract, metaphysical explanation that is just as confusing as the actual ending itself. One interpretation is that all possible interpretations are true. The reasoning behind that interpretation is that the supercontext descends, or humanity is elevated, or both. All possibilities become the possibility. There is no one conclusion. There is no one definitive statement that can be made, because all definitions are relevant within the infinite diversity of the supercontext. As an example, The Invisibles itself can be interpreted in a variety of ways. The Invisibles are a secret organization, a comic book series written by Grant Morrison, a book written by Sir Miles Delacourt exposing a secret organization, a story rewritten by Ragged Robin, who inserted herself into the comic to change events and become an invisible. And it is an interactive video game about a secret organization. This game was created by King Mob, who is Grant Morrison's proxy in the comic book they're writing about a secret organization called the Invisibles. All of these interpretations are true. More to the point, they are all the same level of truth. One is not more important than the other because they contribute to the overall complexity of the meaning of the Invisibles. The following is one interpretation of the final issue. It is a concrete and simplified explanation for those that desire a feeling of coherency and closure. Dane comforts his old friend Gaz. Gaz eventually dies in Dane's arms. Dane is the final iteration of Buddha, who guides humanity into a new enlightened age. Gaz symbolizes humanity, and Dane talks him through his transition from one state, life, into another, death. This is what occurs through the entire issue. Humanity is in a transition from one state of life into another. Dane also speaks directly to the audience as the comic book transitions from being published to not being published. So, Dane not only ushers all the characters in the comic itself, but the audience who is reading the story. King Mob destroys the King of All Tears, an archon from the outer church. The king dissolves into the super context. This scene needs some elaboration. Key 64 is a substance where words are translated in the mind as being real. This was seen in King Mob's torture sequence from the first volume. As Dane told King Mob in the second volume, if our words are circles, theirs are bubbles. Naturally, to destroy a bubble, you pop it. This is how the king is defeated with one word. Notably, there is the heavy implication that the king wore the time machine as a fiction suit. As it manifests, it has the shape of the time machine used by Ragged Robin. This may explain why the king wasn't absorbed by Dane during the final confrontation the prior issue. It had disguised itself as another element within the story. Presumably, the liquid software of the time machine was how the king was infected with Key 64. King Mob then reunites with Ragged Robin, who died and merged with the super context on her journey back to the future. NASA makes contact with Barbalith. This causes Barbalith to dissolve into the super context. Or, to continue the metaphor, Barbalith is a bubble, and this contact makes it pop. These influences on humanity are lifted. The super context descends, or humanity is elevated, or both, and we merge with the super context of the multiverse. All time becomes one time. All death becomes one death, just like all life is one life. Full stop. Time machine, go. We made gods and jailers because we felt small and ashamed and alone. We let them try us and judge us, and, like sheep to slaughter, we allowed ourselves to be sentenced. See, now, our sentence is up. Which side are you on? Do you know yet? The Empire never ended.